think we almost died on the vine 7 times or something like that. We just didn't know we're gonna make payroll. We didn't know. We didn't get paid for 5 years. We didn't take a salary for 5 years, and we just, you gotta put skin in the game. The founder has got to have the chutzpah, they've gotta be, I don't know, credibility. They've gotta have a good sense, the resiliency, all that kind of thing, not to give up. But they're gonna stick to it no matter what, because there's gonna be inevitable ups and downs.
Welcome, everybody, to the Founders Network podcast. I am privileged to have as my guest today Barbara Bibas-Montero, who is a fintech operator and investor, best known as co-founder of SafetyPay, where she served as COO, CMO, and was a board member for nearly 15 years, helped scale that company into a global cross-border payment platform, and had a successful exit, $441 million acquisition by PaySafe. Currently, Barbara is managing partner at Seedfunders, where she invests in, mentors early stage founders. So she's got a background in fintech, e-com, marketing, social impact investing, and early career formative years at American Express, and at one point had her own marketing consultancy. So anyhow, Barbara, thank you for being here today for the podcast, and thanks for being a great mentor to the founders at Founders Network and our Miami chapter and globally. Really appreciate you doing this.
Sure, Kevin. It's been such a pleasure getting to know you and working with you. And I love Founders Network. It's such a great organization, and I've got to meet a lot of wonderful people, and founders have to support each other. So you're doing a great job on that. Thank you.
Well, thanks for being part of it. But we're here to talk about, more of your background and what you've done. You've got a really amazing story that I think people should hear. One of the things we talked about prior to this was like, never give up. I append that to say, never fucking give up. This is an important one. But before we get to kind of like the wisdom gained and the lessons learned,
sure.
Maybe we can just set the stage if you want to give us and the listeners more of a, your story. Like, how did it start? Where'd you begin? Where'd you grow up? And how'd you find yourself where you are today? Let's kind of start there, and then we can kind of go back and, very beginning.
Very beginning. Well, I think very beginning, I found that I was kind of entrepreneurial from the beginning. It was in my personality. I loved going door to door, making little things, selling it to. I was 5 years old. I was selling things to neighbors, and
oh wow,
and then I got into washing.
Hold on, what were you selling at 5 years old?
I was artistic, so I made things. Like, I just made little art pieces, and I don't know, it could be Girl Scout cookies. I don't know. It would be anything. If I could get door to door selling, and I just love the engagement and then having a win, that sparked me.
So you're a Girl Scout cookie success story, ultimately.
No, I didn't like selling Girl Scout cookies at all. I was more into creating things, making things. And then as I got older and could manage a hose, I started washing cars. So my brother and I would go around and wash cars. Did that. And then I don't know, I did babysitting. I was just very entrepreneurial, and loved that aspect of it. So I think that carries over into kind of liking getting the reward of making money. I don't know. I guess that was it, a win. Then there was this artistic side of me. And so I ended up volunteering at a day camp to help the art director. And then each year I couldn't get paid. And by the time I turned 16, I ended up getting the director of the art department for the camp. So that was, managing kids and people, and it just at 16. So that was sort of the launch of it. My mother always wanted me to be an artist, but I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot of money in that. So I ended up getting into marketing and travel and things like that. So my early career was airlines, hotels, and finally I landed at American Express. And then that changed my world. And ended up leaving for a bit, going for my MBA. And then I got back to American Express. They hired me back, and it was the Latin American division. And there was this team we worked with that was trying to start business in Latin America. It was very hard, very volatile, lots of
runaway inflation,
economic situations and geopolitical things. And it was tough. And we came across maybe having to close down that division a few times while I was there. They ended up reducing staff, and I was one of the ones that, was stayed on, but the hours were incredible. I mean, we were 14-hour days, no weekends off, trying to save the division. And that's where I had met my husband, Manuel Montero. And so we found that we could work really well together. And of course, one thing led to another, and we ended up getting married. So we left him at Amex, and I went on to Coopers and Lybrand as a director of marketing there. And next thing I know, we were transferred to Spain because Manuel had stayed there, and he became the GM of American Express in Spain. So we had a stint there. A few children later,
Where
I
in Spain were you?
in Madrid.
Madrid. Did you like it?
Loved it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was hard to work there, but as a
Yeah.
lifestyle, it was fantastic.
The siesta.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. They don't do siestas. They just work right on through. So sometimes those business dinners would go on, don't even start eating in Spain until 10 o'clock at night. You're not getting out until 1 a.m. And that was a lot of the scheduling for Manuel. But anyway, in the meantime, I ended up starting my own marketing company, direct marketing company. Manuel ended up leaving American Express, going on to another company. And I ended up with this marketing company getting the American Express account because my old boss became the new general manager. So I ran a direct marketing company, sold to customers of American Express with billing stuffers and catalogs. And I was selling all sorts of merchandise back to selling things like door to door, full circle. And that's what I was going to say. Like when I think back of telling my story, there's a theme that I think we all go through that all of a sudden you look up and are like, yeah, there's something here. You do all these different things, but you sort of realize what your track is. And that's what it was. And it did very well in the beginning. Like I went from 6 months out, I think it was 1.6 million in revenue just off of this little business. And then economic conditions changed. They went through a big recession. There's like the famous word was la crisis, which means crisis. And the next thing I know, I went, skyrocketing upwards. And then it was like barely breaking even to get out of it. But thank God I did. And so that experience alone was that was better than an MBA.
Yeah.
It was like
real world MBA.
Oh, real world, like crisis, how you manage, pivot, all those types of things. So I kind of had a head start, not only with Amex and closing the division, but then also this company. We ended up moving back to the US and that's when I started marketing consulting for small businesses. And it was good. I had young kids and Manuel was working on other projects and he ended up getting involved. I helped him a little bit, but he actually started the first kind of internet in Spanish for the Latin American area, sort of like an eBay of products. And it gained traction. And the crazy story, you just never know with life, is that as he was starting this up with a couple of guys, it was called Fiera. And he was looking for funding and he's riding to Mexico to talk to some people about opening up there. And he sits next to a gentleman there that in first class, he's very passionate about Fiera, all this type of thing. And he goes, I want you to talk to my boss. Do you have time while you're visiting Mexico City? He said, yeah. He ends up meeting Carlos Slim. I loved it. By the time he got back, he had funding, a letter that they were going to fund it for $24 million.
Wow.
That was Manuel.
Just
The
serendipitous.
passion he had, whatever. It was unbelievable that we all were like, wow. And so next thing you know, he's going from a small little group to 150 people and they built the software and everything was go, go, go. And then .com era hit. He ended up having to sell that. So he got his entrepreneurial experience out of corporate. So here we are with our two experiences. Fast forward, we decided corporate life, we're not going back there. No way. So, and we both had the experience of it and we both helped each other in those experiences. But now we decided to do it together. And we started around the dining room table and we just had ideas. We had about 5 ideas. One was was kind of the music industry with a partner, but Napster came along. And then there was another with filmmaking and that fell through. We had products from Spain to import. We even went ahead and got our liquor license so we could sell Spanish wine and paella and, all these things to different things. And one by one, each thing kind of fell. And then there was this one little nugget. It was a guy that had approached Manuel at Fiera, who was trying to start up a payments company, who was in Chile, and he just wanted to buy a computer part in California. And he had no way to pay for it. So he asked Manuel if Fiera would just give him a letter saying that for an investor to say that Fiera would accept the payment system. So they had a vehicle to, test it out, beta test it, I guess. And with that letter, he got funding from a group investors in Puerto Rico. Well, then, what hit the fan? Fiera had to close. It was sold off as a shell company. It was a bloodbath for a lot of companies.
A combust you're referring to.
Combust, victim of that, whatever. You got to move on. And because of that niceness, that kindness that he offered to this man with the payment system.
Yeah.
He got this random call from that same gentleman and said, "Would you like to be our CEO?" And that's when all full steam ahead went into that payment system that eventually became SafetyPay.
I love that story. I love the serendipity of meeting Carlos Slim, who's, I think, billionaire in Mexico.
Yeah.
The cement, doesn't he own the big cement company or something like this, or industrial?
He owns
everything.
Yeah. But it's mostly communications.
Yeah. Communications. Okay. Thank you.
Communications.
Yeah. I knew the name.
Yeah.
And then, so serendipitously goes, and I hear the story so often where it's just like, couldn't have planned that. You couldn't have put that in a business plan. You couldn't have put that on your calendar as like or a rock or an OKR, or a tactic, right? But just showing up and going, and then look what happens. And then
showing up is important. You just give up and keep showing up, because you just never know what's gonna pop. Yeah. And be passionate, because if he wasn't passionate with that guy on the plane and got the vibe from him, showcase the concept, it never would have happened. So, but anyway, it was very serendipitous. And and
there's the idea of the knowing yourself, right? And looking at across varied experiences of selling art door to door. And then, finding out that now you're the director of the art camp, later, and now you're the doing your own marketing, direct market, which is kind of art door to door in a way, right? On door hangers or whatever. I don't know, kind of print, if you're doing print and that kind of stuff, or
marketing was perfect for me.
Yeah.
So it taps into the creative. It's much more analytical now, but it was, I got into advertising, PR, a lot of data analysis, just it tapped into so many different things. It's a nice modality to, if you're multidimensional or any of that, really good. Yeah.
I mean, I think like your story is like very common in the sense that, a lot of entrepreneurs have these stories of earliest memory is I was selling the cliche of selling lemonade, right? And there's a creativity too of entrepreneurs that you mentioned when you and Manuel like both realized you couldn't work at Amex and you couldn't go corporate anymore. At Founders Network, we call that unemployable. Founders realize they're unemployable. They just want to do their own thing. So you guys had that moment.
Yeah, my father had a word for that. You hit a wall with corporate. If you're not going to be advancing into the upper suite, then you're just hanging out. And he goes, he used to call it. He cracks me up because he's very funny. But he goes, "Yeah, they're popoed. You get to the point where you're popoed. P-O-P-O. It means pissed off on and passed over." So that was That was my fatherism.
That's.
He also said never give up. So that was one of his.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Yeah. But I think a lot of people now are going through that now. It just gets to the point where you really want to do this soul sucking, it's like,
yeah. Well, they're also getting laid off in droves as well. So they're being forced to confront that.
Yes.
And then I wanted to also reiterate like the serendipity of this one payment company. And like somebody put it to me once where like, you never know who's going to be in a position to help you in the future. So like help others and like, do what you can to help others because it will come back to you. And so it totally did. And this was the origin story of SafetyPay.
Yeah, it was. And this gentleman is now, he just left he was a 27-year-old kid, brilliant. And we took him in and the three of us sat around the table and in the small, the dining room table basically, and started this thing. And he was more IT oriented and I did the marketing and the writing, a lot of writing. That's where my English major thing came out because I was doing all sorts of decks and things and went on to do white papers and business case studies and all that thing around the concept. Whereas Manuel took on, of course, finance and money raising. And then Adrian was our guy who actually ended up becoming the CEO of Avianca Airlines. And he's done great things. So it was a pleasure to work with him. But yeah, so what else happened? So then we got on track, and I guess the one by one we started hiring the old team from American Express days that we went through hell together and came out, and we had those same people came back and became founders or business advisors. Our old boss, the head of division, became very involved, Bernie Hamilton, and his old roommate from Notre Dame joined our board. It was just, and even getting the first sale, like we had to do a lot those first 5 years. It wasn't easy, but we had work. The concept was to work with the online banking platform. And then the mortgage crisis hit, and that we were trying to knock on the doors of banks and say, hey, we're your pal. We're not trying to compete with you. And we'd go pretty far with them. And then all of a sudden, political things, economic issues happen, just like the dot-com bust. It happened with banks and the mortgage crisis and KYC and MSBs. We have to get the money, the licenses that we had to get for every single state. And it was just becoming cost prohibitive and difficult to work with banks. At one point, a bank took in all our information, and what do they call it? It's not cannibalization. I forget the name for it, but they basically ran with it, said, okay, we got it from here. And they just took the whole concept and tried to replicate it. They couldn't. So I won't mention their name, but yeah, that was shocking. And, what are we going to do? Sue them? We didn't have enough money to do that. So
yeah,
there was all sorts of things like that. And then finally, we realized our sweet spot was Latin America. And it was one of our colleagues, our, employees whose father-in-law was head of BBVA in Peru. And the rest is history. Because of that connection, and we got in, and then we almost lost him, but he took him out to a soccer game and to dinner. And then, he got back on. And then once one banks is on, the others start to follow. And then all of a sudden, once we got the banks, we got the credibility, then we got the merchants, and everything kind of just fell into place. And then and the funding, we were drip funded for so long. It was awful. We were like, have to be resuscitated I think we almost died on the vine 7 times or something like that. We just didn't know we were going to make payroll. We didn't know. We had some con artists. Everything was thrown at our feet, to trip over. Somehow the team didn't want it to fail. We kept trying. And then all of a sudden the funding finally came in, and I think it was 7 million from the International Finance Committee from the World Bank. And that was the big game changer, credibility, and some runway for a while. And
how long did you have to go in this kind of eat what you kill mode? How many years?
Years.
Yeah.
But we had a great board of directors, and they were also investors. So it would be like we'd be running out, and then, they had this famous trifecta of the 3 investors said, okay, if you go in, I'll go in. And it was that kind of thing. And that saved us. But it was smart, because I think that's good for investing. Don't be the sole investor to save the company. Like, you're going to put skin in the game. I want 2 other guys to put skin in. And I thought that was.
And these are all board members as well?
Yeah.
Or
Investor
okay.
and board.
Yeah.
When the IFC finally gave their money, 3 weeks later, Manuel was gone. He had a massive heart attack and died. And that was like, wow. That's when the team really came together. That was unbelievable. I'm so touched by how people did come through, because the losses weren't, obviously Manuel gone, and we all, cared about him, loved him. But it was more like we didn't want to see his death go in vain. That's where the team really came through. And we had to also, by contract, basically key man was gone. We legally had to get back all the money, which a lot of it was spent already. We had a big bills and things. And so that was hard, but they gave us an option. If you can make these numbers in the next few months, then okay, we'll think about it. And the board members that were investors really worked at it. Everybody came together. We also had 80 employees by that time in 14 countries. So there was going to be a major hit for all of us if that money had to go back, and then we would have had that money. And it just, I can't even think about what that would have been,
Yeah.
But the key people, I remember our CFO and our attorney, came to me and said, we're going to save for this. And they basically, I was propped up to take over to manage it. And they made me COO, and the board of directors voted me in until we could get another CEO. I knew I was not up for that position.
Yeah.
Was tapped to stabilize, and I did the best I could, and it worked. And,
Yeah.
very emotional, tough time, but,
I can
everybody,
imagine. Yeah.
yeah. But
It's
then
remarkable that you guys, you could totally easily see the company collapsing at that point, right?
easily, and it came so close. It came very close, but the team, like they were doing vigils in Peru and
Mm.
Colombia for Manuel, and they were just like, no, we got to make those numbers. And everybody came together, and we just had a banner year. We finally broke even and made profit, because we were sort of limping along as a break even,
Yeah.
for a while. And then it was just that board meeting at the end of the year, and we didn't know if we were going to get funded again, and then we all had to leave after the presentations, and they deliberated and came out and told us we're in. And
I mean, it's almost like uh, it's almost like a Hollywood movie
it was,
script in a way. Yeah.
yeah, it was. But I'm so grateful for everybody. And people left. I mean, yeah, I had to step down. They, that's when I became a board member. That was if I have to step out of the company because the new guy that was coming in didn't want to work with founders. And
Hmm.
that's kind of a thing I learned.
Oh, that's interesting.
But
Yeah.
it is interesting because when you get that second tier group coming in that has to really scale it, founders sometimes get in the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't like to believe I wasn't really that way, but I
Hmm.
did try to help as best I could. But I think it was probably hard for the guys to see the remembrance of Manuel through me. And that was probably hard. Then
Yeah.
I get it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's natural to have people want to bring in their leadership and whatnot.
Yeah, and without somebody, balking over it. But then I became a board member, and I was on the board of directors for about 2 years, I think. And then finally I was to step down, and, they took it from there. And so I really want to say, it's like a marathon race. You just hand over the baton and then let the next person run. And so Manuel handed over his baton in a big way.
In a big way. Yeah.
We all carried it. I carried it for a few months, and then it was time for me to hand the baton on. And I just want to say that the team, a lot of our original team left, and they started their own payments companies. I'm still
Mm.
in touch with them. I'm very proud of them. One was an intern.
Oh, wow.
He was unbelievable. And so I credit the next 4 years, I think, or 5 years when I was stepping away, that they took it to the next level. And it wasn't easy, but I really commend them because they made it happen. And I cannot take credit for that big sale other than that I got them to a level
Yeah.
they could run with it.
Well, 0 to 1 is an art in
Yeah.
itself, and it's the heavy lifting, the birthing the new
Yeah.
that actually is what Founders Network's all about. And there's very few cases actually of Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, the rule is more that you have the 0 to 1 CEO, founders, and then you have the rapid, the hyperscale or the public company CEO, right? These are 3 different personas, rarely just one. And so it's actually
It's
typical. Yeah.
very true. Yeah. And that's what they brought in the big guns. And this gentleman had many exits and
Mm.
experiences, and they just wanted the exit. And he
Yeah.
did everything by the book to get it to that point. He managed it. And he and the new CEO got along really well, and they worked well together, and the board became all good friends. So they took it and ran with it.
So help me out with like the timeline here. What was your tenure up until that point where you rolled off the board?
I think I was off the board in 2016. So Manuel,
So about
he
10 years?
passed. Yeah, well, the company technically got incorporated in '03, end of '03.
Oh, wow.
Didn't
Okay.
really get a lot of traction till 5 years later,
Yeah.
where we had proof of concept, and, so that was like '07, '08. Something like that. And then we hit it with Peru and got that traction in LATAM. And then we opened up in Europe So then we were really cranking and the investments were starting to come in, but trickling in, but it seemed to be hard to sustain that because it was a drip
Yeah.
funded type of thing, which
Yeah.
kept us on the noose the whole time.
Yeah.
And so then when the IOC came in, which was in 2013, that's when we could breathe a little and we're ready to take it to the next level. We had everything in place to storm the castle basically,
Yeah.
but it was just like,
Yeah.
so yeah, the timeline for me was, '03 in the beginning to 2013. By 2014, that's when I became COO and I stepped down, I think, the beginning of 14 and was
Yeah.
the directors for about 2 years.
Well, anyways, it's over a decade. It's closer to a
Yeah.
decade and a half.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I want that to be clear to founders, right? That's what, you should expect. You should plan for,
Well, you
right?
wanna have good investors that believe in you because they kept us alive. I don't know.
Tell me about that. Like when you reflect on that group that kept you sustained, how'd you find them? How'd you get to know them? How'd you build a relationship? How did you sort of, get them so deeply involved and committed to you guys?
Well, a lot of it was our days in American Express. So one of our key early founders was the ex-CFO of American Express company, and we knew all that, that's like a tribe or a family in
Mm,
itself. And so our old boss, he was in finance and started the Latin American division up in New York. I actually sat next to him when I was working there in New York and we were friends. And then I went off to grad school and I got recruited back when he started in Miami. And so I got the job again. And so it was good back. Bernie Hamilton, I was able to be back with Bernie and Bernie introduced me to Manuel. The rest is history. Yeah.
was he
He's very much in my,
officiate your wedding or?
I mean, he was at my wedding.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was an Amex reunion,
that's
basically,
neat.
wedding, yeah. And then, his good buddy was the CFO of finance at one time for American Express. And then we had an ex-American Express banker, head of the American Express Bank,
Hmm.
who was an early investor. And then finally, I guess because the bank relationships were so important, and Manuel worked a lot with banks and American Express when he was there. So he had those contacts. So that's probably a big one. Trying to think what else fed into that. Oh, okay. So one of our first big investors was the Spirito Santo Bank, who's was big down here in Miami. And they kind of gave us our first, besides friends and family, they gave us a little leg up. What's the word? Credibility factor. So that started it. And then because of that, more investors came on board. And then the second one was actually a roommate from a Bernie's and good friend from Notre Dame that he was in Venezuela doing really, really well. And I guess there was some crises going on down there, as we know. So he joined in and that became a very solid group that, you know, that helped a lot and with their contacts. And then finally, the big one was the IFC. That was
Yeah.
like when that got secured, we knew that we were on the next.
Yeah. Yeah. So you stuck with it for a long time, but there were these, and you had baked in this family from Amex,
Yeah, it seemed, yeah.
right? That was kind of almost in a way, probably added to your commitment to making this succeed, right? Because you had these pre-existing relationships. You didn't want to let them down.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also that we were a well-oiled team as well, having worked through crises in Latin America back in the 80s. Manuel and Bernie worked very close together.
Hmm.
And to be back in the saddle again, was kind of natural, which I think is kind of cool. Like when you've been in the trenches with the corporate life, and you've worked well with people together. I think it's a beautiful thing that you go back to your team because they're already vetted big time,
Yeah.
especially when you're putting those long hours in. So
Yeah. The work ethic also stands out as a key part of your
yeah,
story, and probably dealing with that volatility also sort
well,
of
try being,
prepared you for startup life.
try being,
What is it? What did you learn from that? Did you learn anything? Because we have like founders in the network who work with their
yeah.
husband or wife. Like, did you learn anything that might be relevant for them about how to make that work that maybe you learned the hard way? Or
I don't know. I think there was just a natural flow with Manuel and myself.
Mm.
We complemented each other in skill sets. So, what my superpowers were, versus his superpowers, they somehow meshed really well. And then communication. Yes, it's hard to, carry something from home into the office or something, but I don't know. We just flowed. We had a lot of respect for each other and, and we met working with each other. The other thing happened later. So I was
Mm.
already used to him being my boss, so
Mm.
this ego thing. And he could, he recognized my worth, which is important as recognized his, and we knew how to navigate around that. So it somehow, I don't know if you've got two strong egos and, someone that's dismissive of another person's value, I mean, those are the things that are probably going to be red flags for marriage
Yeah.
into the office. But if you have that already baked into the foundation, then
Yes.
it'll work.
You had worked together and actually met through work, right? So it almost
Yeah.
it's almost yeah, baked in. That stands out to me. And
And
he
love.
valued
Love
your
helps too.
yeah.
Love and respect.
Did you find because you mentioned like 14-hour days at Amex and whatnot, but did you guys just work constantly? Were you always talking about, safety pay and startup, or did you have ways to sort of carve out time for just a relationship or
Oh, yeah, and we did things as a family once the girls came on board, we involved them in there, and they'd do their homework, and then the conference room, they just had to walk over. It was nice being able to walk to work,
that's neat.
walk from school, and, so we shared a lot of family time that way, and I took on the role more of, attending to the kids as well, so it was ideal that I had that flexibility to
Hmm.
work with he could do. But yeah, we'd go do our parental stuff, whatever, and then we'd go back to the office and work till 10.
Yeah.
It was just fluid. It was just a
Yeah.
fluid type of experience that was just incorporated into our lives. I have, how it impacted the kids is a natural. She just loves the entrepreneurial stuff. The other one, it probably wasn't her thing, but
Hmm.
she tolerated it, enough, so I'm sure she got some good things out of it, but you never know how it impacts the kids, but,
Yeah.
we did the best we could, but
It's true of any profession,
yeah, well, it's
and yeah.
stress. I mean, some people are, if you're HSP, highly sensitive person,
Mm.
like, to be in this constant mode of having to think about it, but no, we did we talked about other things. Sometimes we just like, "Let's stop. Let's take a mental break from talking about safety pay,"
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
there were other things to talk about.
Yeah. Well, it's what I'm getting from you is that you guys figured out a way to design your lives to where you could sustain this for 10, 15 years, right? Um and it worked. And you also mentioned, that your husband had valued what you did. And I wanted to talk about that. I wanted to talk about, your kind of zone of genius around PR and positioning and go to market, and especially early on. And I wanted to make sure that the founders listening to this can kind of learn from you about that.
Sure, yeah, I was gonna say that we talked about my you asked me how I wanted my name. That was always a confusing point, but there was, perception that he wanted to keep that we weren't mom and pop. So
Uh-huh.
I
Uh-huh.
went with my maiden name, and sometimes it got us in a little bit of a funny predicaments, but for the most part, it was like, "Oh, you guys are married," like, I don't like doing that to people, but on the surface, it was, when you're doing a pitch deck and you're like, there's
I think
Manuel
it's
Montero, Barbara Montero, I'm like, and
yeah.
it's not good look in the beginning if you wanna just and then you can tell them later,
Yeah.
but
I,
yeah,
I've heard that, some people it'll be a disqualifier because of, say, risk that,
it is a risk. I
a
look
extra
at it.
risk. Yeah. Yeah. And then others that like it because you can also point to lots of success stories of, hey,
Yes,
these people have to make this work. You
right. Yes. Gotta be hungry enough. But no, I think that, look, Manuel was very fair, passionate leader.
know?
And one thing I really, admired in him was that he was fair to all people and he really valued women's talent, you know, which was a good thing. He knew how to blend it and all that. So I feel blessed that that happens because
Yeah.
sometimes it's another road for women,
Yeah.
they go through a lot. And he included people and
It's
believed in
cool.
that. So and it
Like that.
shows in his daughters too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But the skill set that I brought was, I would put
Yeah, let's
all
talk about that.
and a lot of it was the writing I was mentioning before. So they would lock me in a back room in the office and just I concentrate on putting out all the materials and got to do brochures and creative. And then the biggest game changer, this is what one thing I share is because we were just hitting the wall, he'd go and present and whatever. And finally we did a video. And that's what I grew up in a filmmaker's household.
Mm,
My
mm,
father's
that's
filmmaker.
right.
And so when we started videos, and then my one daughter was studying film, so she did a video for it for some of the marketing. That one video, we had it professionally done. It was the game changer. All of a sudden, there's funny things how the visual is so much more powerful in the messaging than just doing pitch decks and
Hmm.
PowerPoints and
Yeah.
we did plenty of, and it seemed like it just changed something in it. And so that was a medium we used. And then the PR, which we've talked about before, the PR was um, going about it in a smart way, credible way, instead of just, blasting the news, you know, press releases and things that are
Yeah.
don't meet to it and overspending on ads or, whatever. So we just found, went to a lot of conferences and partnerships we maintained with people. And little by little we had those little catchy stories or something here. And
Yeah.
quite frankly, we hired a very good PR firm that got us started, but we just used them for 3 months to get us started, and I could take it from there and found the little formulas to work directly with, business platforms or, PR net or, whatever at the time. I don't even know what they are now. I haven't done much of this in a while, but I just found my angles and that added credibility. And next thing I know, we're in a white paper with McKinsey and Company,
Mm,
you know, companies to watch for, you know.
yeah. And that you mentioned the credibility gap. Sure that this all has to do with sort of cross, especially in fintech.
Yeah. Yeah. Fintech and how much it's changed, but then in some ways it hasn't changed a bit, but it's a very lucrative area and you find your right little angle, your little niche groups. And like I said, we have some employees that went on to start their own payment systems.
Yeah.
They're doing very well. So there's a lot of
You
room.
talked about common mistakes founders make in this area. Are there any like lessons there for founders listening to think about?
Hmm.
I mean, you mentioned blasting PR is not blasting a press release on the wire.
That's true. Yeah, don't overspend, on things because your money can go fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Can you go deeper on that? I mean, you had to survive sort of hand to mouth for so many years with the funding. I would imagine that, being capital efficient or frugal is a core value that you guys had.
well, I don't want to discourage people, but we didn't get paid for 5 years.
I think that's a great thing to share with founders.
Truth
Because I
be
think we're
told.
coming at, in 1999, I think there was like 50 billion across venture and, in the dot-com boom. And now there's like, that's around for OpenAI, right? There's so much money in the system. And I think it can lead to sort of, people not appreciating that like the scarcity of funding that's not always, the merry-go-round will stop, right? And you don't want to be left without,
Yeah.
that funding round.
If you're gonna go jump into something like that, I do believe you have to have some financial runway to take the risk. And then
Hmm.
it's very motivating as the time
Yeah.
gets near to yeah, so that's what we did. I mean, we'd had some savings, we did all bad, but yeah, it got dicey there for a bit, you know. Yeah.
Let's transition into what you're doing now. Seed funders, you're investing on the other side of the table. I would reckon that a lot of this lived experience informs how you approach making investment decisions in early stage founders. Can you share more about that and like what you see in terms of like blind spots from the founders, or I don't know, the inverse of maybe that is kind of what makes you lean in when you're before there's traction.
But yeah. Um, because I saw it from the other side as well with the VCs were asking us and investors. And then I honed in on it when I was looking to invest or represent seed funders to maybe, put money in. And I think first and foremost, hands down, is the founder. The founder has got to have the chutzpah, they've got to be, I don't know, credibility. They've got to have a good sense, the resiliency, all that kind of thing, not to give up. They're going to stick to it no matter what, because there's going to be inevitable ups and downs. And how do you pivot? How do you manage crises and things like that? I think that's really execution ability, all those types of things. And I guess the other thing I would look at is traction signals, like things like, in an early stage, it'd be nice that they've watching, of course, the budgets and, I get turned first personally, I get red flag for me is they get money and then all of a sudden they start paying themselves.
Mm,
You can see that I'm a little sensitive to it. I didn't take a
mhm,
salary for 5 years and we just, you got to put skin in the game.
mhm,
But how much traction do you have on the concept? How much financial runway do you have? And then if you could start making some kind of revenue, even in the minuscule amount, you've done the proof of concept, you're there, and then you add that that drive from the founder and that stick to itiveness and that
mm.
not giving up and pivoting smartly, that's what I'm for. Um,
Can we explore that a little bit more? Because I think you might have mentioned, like, I finished my startup was during the dot-com bust, right? And we had we had conversations about recycling paper clips,
yeah,
uh, and then my MBA I finished in '09, right after the '08.
yeah.
But for many years now, like, a lot of founders have been living in a very rich time, and there's just a lot of money in the system, and there. But these ideas around, like, being capital efficient and skin in the game, like, can you explain that to a founder who may not get it? Why shouldn't I pay myself? What's the rationale for why they shouldn't pay themselves for, say, 5 years? How are they getting compensated?
Well, first of all, I would not recommend that to anybody.
Okay.
That's
Good to clarify that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
had to clarify that. I'm just saying you're talking about a person, two people that didn't pay themselves for 5 years and put so much skin in the game. That's excessive, personally. But if there's some kind of, it's not like you can't pay yourself. It's like be reasonable in it. We've had guys come and they're paying themselves 200 grand a year, and they want the big bucks, but it's to pay them. And I'm thinking, well, maybe you gotta say 60,000 a year for now, for a year. And then, you can also write off some expenses and things like that. But for the most part, you have to have that, I think, the financial runway to get going, or friends and family that are investing to get you that thing. But to me, it's more the number versus, happening at all, so I just use an example that makes me a little bit more sensitive to someone paying them too much.
Well, I was also thinking about equity, right? What are
Yeah.
you working for as a founder?
Yes.
You're making your money on equity, right? And that's the whole thing. The whole thing is driven by equity, right?
Right, exactly. But as happens is that as you keep navigating through and you have to give up equity, as if you go into crisis, you're giving up more equity to pay people. That's how we paid people. And it came out okay. But if that company goes under, it doesn't make it, which we came very close, then equity is what good is it at this point? So yeah,
Yeah.
that's the trade-off. Yeah.
Is there a lesson learned for you about equity and managing equity as a founder for other, like, early stage founders to help them think about it? Whole idea here is, like, let's not reinvent the wheel and have them learn the hard lessons on their own, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think ours is a kind of unique case, because there's so many different things in it. I almost felt like there was some kind of uh, like the universe didn't want us to totally fail because we just kept getting resuscitated again. It was
Mm,
almost miraculous.
mm,
But um, I think ours is an extreme case for the
yeah.
most, like when I advise people, like I can give you an example, like there was a woman that, she had a really nice job and she had a partner that they were going to start this new thing with a government contract possibly that she could get, but it was keeping her back, being working. And I said, okay, well, what is your runway? 6 months. I said, you're definitely marketable. You can get back into something like this. Okay. When do you think you could really get this thing going? I said, a month and a half. And I just said, do it. Just go for it. Action to go. And she called me back like, 6 months later and she goes, thank you. I just made my first 1.5 million because she did it. So it's
That's
just
fast.
jumping in and she didn't have
Yeah.
to get paid. So I'm talking about that type of time frame versus
Yeah.
what we were doing. But
Yeah.
I think I don't know. I don't know why it was so darn hard, but it just was.
Yeah. It makes for a more epic story. I feel like
The hero's arc in literature. Or the
totally.
Iliad, fighting
Yeah.
foxes
They were lost in the wilderness and washed ashore on an island.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, it is. And I think also like what motivates founders is not the risk adjusted returns, right?
No,
It is the journey. It is the story and the odyssey. Speaking of odysseys, in your odyssey, one of the things that, like you said, it's not a normal story, is the fact that you went through so much and you went through so much losing your husband in the middle of it. I want to like return to that and talk about lessons learned and messages for founders and Barbara's story, and people can remember that and take something away from it. You didn't give up, and it was this beautiful thing where the visuals in the Latin American team and like everybody like almost like a Hollywood script, right? Like a montage thing. Wow, it's like it gives me the chills talking about it.
it's gonna be a story. I've gotta get back to writing and write it out.
Yeah,
You're helping me, you know that,
it's
Kevin.
in your blood. I mean, because your dad was in Hollywood, right?
Yes.
Filmmaker. Yeah,
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I'm doing now is working with, my dad's story and stuff, but I wanna do the safety pay story. So, like I said, you're putting me out
good,
there
good,
verbally.
good, good. Okay,
We
yeah,
go
people are
back
gonna
and
want
we
to.
start
This is the pre-marketing.
the pre-marketing.
But like, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's so intuitive that it's hard to, distill what that is that allowed you or enabled you to keep going. But like, are there thoughts you have to share about it? I mean,
About never
about
giving up and keep
yeah, never
yeah.
giving up and sticking with it. Like what?
I could talk it's a very big theme in my life because it was a theme my father instilled in me, never give up, and I mean, we have time, I can talk about a little bit of that, but,
Yeah, that's a great note
he
for us to wrap on.
okay, so with my dad, it's gotta be in the DNA because I think of him making a film. He was a madman, Madison Avenue guy, and, his journey was so interesting, twists and turns and ups and downs, but he got tapped to to make a documentary for the Kennedy administration to show that America wasn't such warmongers, that, they're gonna repurpose a battleship, make it into a hospital ship and do a maiden voyage from San Francisco to Indonesia and help doctors fight diseases and all that stuff. And they wanted a filmographer to go on there on board. So he did it. And in the mill, he's contracted by the ad agency and they fired him. And it says, we're not going to do this anymore. It's over budget or whatever it was. And so he just said, in lieu of payment, would you just please give me the footage? I've got a film here. So he put it together and came back and showed it. And it was amazing and lovely and heartfelt. And he didn't give up. And then I guess the client submitted it to the Academy and he wins an Oscar.
Wow,
Yeah. I have it in my living room as
that's
inspiration.
cool.
So that's that never give up thing. And then as my dad was bowing out of life, I used to paint. That was the thing. I used to give gifts as paintings to my father. And he asked me, he saw this thing on a doctor's office and he says, could you paint this for me? So it was my last painting for him. And what it was a crane, like a Florida crane bird, and he's now eating a frog and it's got it in his mouth and the legs are sticking out like this and his head's down halfway down his throat, but the frog's legs, arms are like grasping the neck and blocking the whole passage of him being swallowed. And it says at the bottom, never give up. So that was my last painting to him. And it's very important theme in our lives to not give up. There's always this one last ditch effort to do it.
Yeah.
And so I actually, my dad made a TV series called The Veil. Again, the company that he was with Hal Roach Studios, and he made the series with Boris Karloff, and it's all over the internet. If you look up The Veil and Frank Bibas, you'll see the films. And right in the snack in the middle of it, the studio goes bankrupt. He loses everything. I mean, Boris Karloff didn't even get paid, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a great message. Like I said, I should amend what I said. It's never FN give up. Founders Network FN. Yeah. Yeah. Incidentally, growing up, we had that picture on our refrigerator, the crane and the frog. Yeah. Well, we appreciate it at Founders Network, and thank you for taking the time to share your story, and hope people got something out of it, took some kernels, something that is useful and motivational. And yeah, Barbara, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.